The history of Norfolk Island dates back to the 14th or 15th century when it was settled by Polynesian seafarers. Early history Norfolk Island was first settled by East Polynesian seafarers either from the Kermadec Islands north of New Zealand or from the North Island of New Zealand. They arrived in the 14th or 15th century, and survived for several generations before disappearing. Their main village site has been excavated at Emily Bay, and they also left behind stone tools, the Polynesian rat, and banana trees as evidence of their sojourn. The harakeke, or New Zealand flax plant, was brought to Norfolk Island either from New Zealand directly or from Raoul Island by these Polynesian settlers. The so-called flax is, in fact, no relation of the European flax but is related to the daylily and other genera within the subfamily Hemerochilidaceae. The final fate of the early settlers remains a mystery. The first European known to have sighted the island was Captain James Cook, in 1774, on his second voyage to the South Pacific on HMS Resolution. He named it after the Duchess of Norfolk. The Duchess was dead at the time of the island sighting by Cook, but Cook had set out from England in 1772 and could not have known of her May 1773 death. Cook went ashore on Tuesday the 11th of October 1774. And is said to have been impressed with the tall straight trees and New Zealand flax plants, which, although not related to the Northern Hemisphere flax plants after which they are named, produce fibers of economic importance. He took samples back to Britain and reported on their potential uses for the Royal Navy. Andrew Kippis as the biographer of this voyage puts it as follows: as the Resolution pursued her course from New Caledonia, land was discovered, which, on a nearer approach, was found to be an island, of good height, and 5 leagues in circuit. Captain Cook named it Norfolk Isle, in honour of the noble family of Howard. It was uninhabited, and the first persons that ever set foot on it were unquestionably our English navigators. Various trees and plants were observed that are common at New Zealand, and in particular, the flax plant, which is rather more luxuriant here than in any other part of that country. The chief produce of the island is a kind of spruce pine, exceedingly straight and tall, which grows in great abundance. Such is the size of many of the trees that, breast high, they are as thick as 2 men can fathom. Among the vegetables of the place, the palm cabbage afforded both a wholesome and palatable refreshment, and, indeed, proved the most agreeable repast that our people had for a considerable time enjoyed. The cabbage palm referred to as a cabbage tree species Cordyline obtecta, also found in New Zealand, the edible heart of which resembles a small cabbage. At the time, Britain was heavily dependent on flax and hemp from the shores of the Baltic seaports. Any threat to their supply endangered Britain's sea power. The UK also relied on timbers from New England for mainmasts, and these were not supplied after the American War of Independence. The alternative source of Norfolk Island for these supplies is argued by some historians, notably Geoffrey Blainey in Tyranny of Distance, as being a major reason for the founding of the convict settlement of New South Wales by the First Fleet in 1788. James Cook said that, except for New Zealand, in no other island in the South Sea was wood and mast timber so ready to hand. Sir John Call, Member of Parliament and the Royal Society, and former Chief Engineer of the East India Company, stated the advantages of Norfolk Island in a proposal for colonisation he put to the Home Office in August 1784. This island has an advantage not common to New Caledonia, New Holland and New Zealand by not being inhabited, so that no injury can be done by possessing it to the rest of mankind. There seems to be nothing wanting but inhabitants and cultivation to make it a delicious residence. The climate, soil, and sea provide everything that can be expected from them. The timber, shrubs, vegetables and fish already found there need no embellishment to pronounce them excellent samples. But the most invaluable of all is the flax plant, which grows more luxuriant than in New Zealand. George Forster, who had been on Cook's second voyage to the Pacific and had been with him when he landed on Norfolk Island, was at the time professor of natural history at the University of Vilna in Polish-Lithuania. Forster discussed the proposed Botany Bay colony in an article written in November 1786, New Holland, und die British colony in Botany Bay. Though unaware of the British intention to settle Norfolk Island, which was not announced until 5 December 1786, Forster referred to the nearness of New Zealand, the excellent flax plant that grows so abundantly there, its incomparable shipbuilding timber, as among the advantages of the new colony. The proposal written by James Matra under the supervision of Sir Joseph Banks for establishing a settlement in New South Wales, stated that Botany Bay was no further than a fortnight from New Zealand, which is covered with timber even to the water's edge. The trees are so big and tall that a single tree is enough to make a mast of a first-rate man of war. New Zealand produces in addition flax, which is an object equally of utility and curiosity. Any quantity of it might be raised in the colony, as this plant grows naturally in New Zealand. It can be made to serve the various purposes of cotton, hemp and linen, and is easier manufactured than any of them. In naval affairs, it could not fail of being of the utmost consequence, a cable of 10 inches being supposed to be of equal strength and durability to one of European hemp of 18 inches. In 1786 the British government included Norfolk Island as an auxiliary settlement, as proposed by John Call, in its plan for colonisation of New South Wales. The flax and ship timber of New Zealand were attractive, but these prospective advantages were balanced by the obvious impossibility of forming a settlement there in the face of undoubted opposition from the native Maori. There was no native population to oppose a settlement on Norfolk Island, which also possessed those desirable natural resources, but the island was too small of itself to sustain a colony. Hence the ultimate decision for a dual colonization along the lines proposed by Call. The decision to settle Norfolk Island was taken under the impetus of the shock Britain had just received from Empress Catherine II of Russia. Practically all the hemp and flax required by the Royal Navy for cordage and sailcloth was imported from the Russian dominions through the ports of St. Petersburg and Riga. Controller of the Navy Sir Charles Middleton explained to Prime Minister Pitt in a letter of 5 September 1786, "It is for hemp only we are dependent on Russia. Masts can be procured from Nova Scotia, and iron in plenty from the ores of this country. But as it is impracticable to carry on a naval war without hemp, it is materially necessary to promote the growth of it in this country and Ireland." In the summer of 1786, the Empress Catherine, in the context of tense negotiations on a renewed treaty of commerce, had emphasized her control over this vital commodity by asking the merchants who supplied it to restrict sales to English buyers. "The Empress has, contrary to custom, speculated on this commodity," complained the author of a subsequent memorandum to the Home Secretary. "It is unnecessary," said the memorandum, "to remark the consequences which might result from a prohibition of supply from that quarter altogether." This implicit threat to the viability of the Royal Navy became apparent in mid-September and caused the Pitt administration to begin an urgent search for new sources of supply, including from Norfolk Island, which was then added to the plan to colonize New South Wales. The need for an alternative non-Russian source of naval stores is indicated by the information from the British ambassador in Copenhagen, Hugh Elliot, who wrote to Foreign Secretary, Lord Carmarthen on 12 August 1788. "There is no topic so common in the mouths of the Russian ministers, as to insist on the facility with which the Empress, when mistress of the Baltic, either by conquest, influence, or alliance with the other two northern powers, could keep England in a state of dependence for its Baltic commerce and naval stores." On 6 December 1786, an order in council was issued, designating the eastern coast of New South Wales, or some one or other of the islands adjacent, as the destination for transported convicts, as required by the Transportation Act of 1784 that authorized the sending of convicted felons to any place appointed by the King and Council. Norfolk Island was thereby brought officially within the bounds of the projected colony. An article in the Daily Universal Register of 23 December 1786 revealed the plan for a dual colonization of Norfolk Island and Botany Bay. The ships for Botany Bay are not to leave all the convicts there. Some of them are to be taken to Norfolk Island, which is about 800 miles east of Botany Bay, and about 400 miles short of New Zealand. The advantage of Britain's new colony in providing a non-Russian source of flax and hemp for naval supplies was referred to in an article in Lloyd's Evening Post of 5 October 1787 which urged, "It is undoubtedly the interest of Great Britain to remain neutral in the present contest between the Russians and the Turks," and observed, "Should England cease to render her services to the Empress of Russia, in a war against the Turks, there can be little of nothing to fear from her ill will. England will speedily be enabled to draw from her colony of New South Wales, the staple of Russia, hemp and flax." First penal settlement. Before the First Fleet sailed to found a convict settlement in New South Wales, Governor Arthur Phillip's final instructions, received less than 3 weeks before sailing, included the requirement to colonize Norfolk Island to prevent it falling into the hands of France, whose naval leaders were also showing interest in the Pacific. Philip's instructions given to him in April 1787 included an injunction to send a party to secure Norfolk Island, as soon as circumstances may admit of it, to prevent its being occupied by the subjects of any other European power. This could only have been a reference to the expedition then in the Pacific commanded by Jean-François de Galaup, Comte de la Pérouse. The Daily Universal Register of the 11th of November 1786 had stated, "The Botany Bay scheme is laid aside, as there is a strong presumption that a squadron from Brest are now, or soon will be, in possession of the very spot we meant to occupy in New Holland." This may have been a reference to a report from the British ambassador in Paris, who had believed that when La Pérouse's expedition set out from Brest in August 1785 it had as one of its objectives the establishment of a settlement in New Zealand to forestall the British. La Pérouse did attempt to visit Norfolk Island, but only to investigate, not to take possession. He had instructions to investigate any colonies the British may have established and learned of the intention to settle Botany Bay and Norfolk Island from dispatches sent to him from Paris through St. Petersburg and by land across Siberia to Petropavlovsk in Kamchatka, where he received them on 26 September 1787, just 4 days before his departure from that port. His ships, the Boussole and Astrolabe, anchored off the northern side of the island on 13 January 1788. But at the time high seas were running that made it too dangerous for the 2 ships' boats that were put out to attempt a landing. It was obvious that I would have had to wait maybe for a very long time for a moment suitable for a landing, and a visit to this island was not worth this sacrifice, he recorded in his journal. Having noted that the island was still uninhabited, he was presumably the less inclined to risk a landing when there was no British settlement there to report on. When the first fleet arrived at Port Jackson in January 1788, Philip ordered Lieutenant Philip Gidley King to lead a party of 15 convicts and 7 free men, including Surgeon Thomas Jameson, to take control of the island and prepare for its commercial development. They arrived on 6 March 1788. During the first year of the settlement, which was also called Sydney, like its parent, more convicts and soldiers were sent to the island from New South Wales. A second village was started at Ball Bay, named after the captain of HMS Supply, Lieutenant Henry Lidgebird Ball. On 8 January 1789, the first child was born, Norfolk King, the son of Philip Gidley King and a convict, Anne Annette. A letter from an officer of Marines at New South Wales, 16 November 1788, published in the London newspaper, The World, 15 May 1789, reported the glowing description of the island and its prospects by Philip Gidley King, but also drew attention to the fatal defect of the lack of a safe port. The said island lies near Port Jackson, and is nearly as large as the Isle of Wight. Lieutenant King, who was sent with a detachment of Marines and some convicts, to settle there, gives the most flattering portrayal of it. The island is fully wooded. Its timber is in the opinion of everyone the most beautiful and finest in the world. They are most suitable for masts, yards, spars and such. The New Zealand flax plant grows there in abundance. European grains and seeds also thrive wonderfully well on Norfolk Island. It only lacks a good port and suitable landing places, without which the island is of no use, but with them it would be of the greatest importance for Great Britain. How far these deficiencies can be improved by art and the hand of man, time must decide. An idealized vision of the new British settlement was given in the novel by Therese Forster, Abenteuer auf einer Reise nach Neu-Holland, published in the German women's magazine, Flora for 1793 and 1794. We went towards the center of this small island where at the foot of a round hill a crystal-clear river rushes forth, dividing up further on into several arms. Towards north and west the hill is covered with the most beautiful ploughed fields all the way down to the sea. The sight of these great flax fields is one of the loveliest I ever beheld. The slender stalks, of the most beautiful green and reaching far above a man's head, bent in the gentle breeze that blew from the sea. Their red blossoms, shining like rubies, danced in the green waves. The top of the hill and the whole of the south and east sides are covered with enormous pines whose dark green is enhanced by a pleasant foreground of cabbage palms and banana trees, and I also observed a low bush among them the fruit of which resembles our red currants but is much larger and hangs in purple and red clusters that help to give the whole a gay appearance. The dwellings of the colonists are strewn along the fringes of the forest, and from my post I could see several of them. Simple houses surrounded by barns and stalls and the fields all enclosed with hedges give the region a youthful appearance the like of which is rarely found in Europe. And plants here bloom more luxuriantly and more perfectly with a natural vigor that knows no exhaustion and fears no poverty, a vigor that has disappeared from our continent. It was soon found that the flax was difficult to prepare for manufacturing and no one had the necessary skills. An attempt was made to bring 2 Maori men to teach the skills of dressing and weaving flax, but this failed when it was discovered that weaving was considered women's work and the 2 men had little knowledge of it. The pine timber was found to be not resilient enough for masts and this industry was also abandoned. More convicts were sent, and the island was seen as a farm, supplying Sydney with grain and vegetables during its early years of near starvation. However, crops often failed due to the salty wind, rats, and caterpillars. The lack of a natural safe harbour hindered communication and the transport of supplies and produce. Manning Clark observed that, at first the convicts behaved well, but as more arrived from Sydney Cove, they renewed their wicked practices. These included an attempted overthrow of King in January 1789 by convicts described by Margaret Hazard as incorrigible rogues who took his goodwill for weakness. While some convicts responded well to the opportunities offered to become respectable, most remained idle and miserable wretches, according to Clark, despite the climate and their isolation from previous haunts of crime. The impending starvation at Sydney led to a great transplantation of convicts and Marines to Norfolk Island in March 1790 on HMS Sirius. This attempt to relieve the pressure on Sydney turned to disaster when Sirius was wrecked and, although there was no loss of life, some stores were destroyed, and the ship's crew was marooned for 10 months. This news was met in Sydney with unspeakable consternation. Norfolk Island was now further cut off from Sydney which, with the arrival of the Second Fleet with its cargo of sick and abused convicts, had more pressing problems with which to contend. In spite of this, the settlement grew slowly as more convicts were sent from Sydney. Many convicts chose to remain as settlers on the expiry of their sentence, and the population grew to over 1,000 by 1792. Norfolk Island in 1793 was described by Joseph Espinosa y Tello, an officer of the Spanish expedition led by Alessandro Malaspina that visited New South Wales. The colony of Norfolk, settled shortly after that at Port Jackson, merits little attention both because of the small size of that island and because of the hilly nature of its terrain, and the particular circumstance of its lacking entirely an anchorage or a place where longboats can be drawn up with any security. Despite this, some 1,500 persons live there, and its fertile soil produces copiously all kinds of grains, although the difficulty of clearing the ground covered with trees and undergrowth retards the large harvests which the fertility of the land would yield without that obstacle. The pines are of a prodigious height, straight, thick and of the finest grain, and several have been felled of above 7 feet in diameter at the foot, 6 at 17 and 5 at 37 yards. Having 147 feet of height in total and 120 to the first branches. The flax brought there from New Zealand bears a good aspect, but no great hopes are rested on its cultivation, and it seems that the second trials of this plant made in London have not achieved the happy outcome of the first. Norfolk Island was governed by a succession of short-term commandants for the next 11 years, starting with King's replacement, Robert Ross, from 1789 to 1790. When Joseph Fovo arrived as lieutenant governor in 1800, he found the settlement quite run down, little maintenance having been carried out in the previous 4 years, and he set about building it up, particularly through public works and attempts to improve education. As early as 1794, Lieutenant Governor of New South Wales Francis Grose suggested its closure as a penal settlement as it was too remote and difficult for shipping, and too costly to maintain. By 1803, the Secretary of State, Lord Hobart, called for the removal of part of the Norfolk Island military establishment, settlers and convicts to Van Diemen's Land, due to its great expense and the difficulties of communication between Norfolk Island and Sydney. This was achieved more slowly than anticipated, due to reluctance of settlers to uproot themselves from the land they had struggled to tame, and compensation claims for loss of stock. It was also delayed by King's insistence on its value for providing refreshment to the whalers. The first group of 159 left in February 1805 and comprised mainly convicts and their families and military personnel, only 4 settlers departing. Between November 1807 and September 1808, 5 groups of 554 people departed. Only about 200 remained, forming a small settlement until the remnants were removed in 1813. A small party remained to slaughter stock and destroy all buildings so that there would be no inducement for anyone, especially from another European power, to visit that place. From 15 February 1814 to 6 June 1825 the island lay abandoned. Second penal settlement in 1824 the British government instructed the Governor of New South Wales Thomas Brisbane to occupy Norfolk Island as a place to send the worst description of convicts. Its remoteness, seen previously as a disadvantage, was now viewed as an asset for the detention of the twice convicted men, who had committed further crimes since arriving in New South Wales. Brisbane assured his masters that, the felon who is sent there is forever excluded from all hope of return. He saw Norfolk Island as the nec plus ultra of convict degradation. The convicts detained have long been assumed be a hard core of recidivists, or, doubly convicted capital respites, that is, men transported to Australia who committed fresh colonial crimes for which they were sentenced to death, and were spared the gallows on condition of life at Norfolk Island. However, a recent study has demonstrated, utilizing a database of 6,458 Norfolk Island convicts, that the reality was somewhat different. More than half were detained at Norfolk Island without ever receiving a colonial conviction, and only 15% had been reprieved from a death sentence. Furthermore, the overwhelming majority of convicts sent to Norfolk Island had committed non-violent property sentences. The average length of detention was 3 years, and the scale of punishments inflicted upon the prisoners was significantly less than assumed. His successor, Governor Ralph Darling, was even more severe than Brisbane, wishing that, every man should be worked in irons that the example may deter others from the commission of crime, and, to hold out as a place of the extremest punishment short of death. Governor Arthur in Van Diemen's Land likewise believed that, when prisoners are sent to Norfolk Island, they should on no account be permitted to return. Transportation thither should be considered as the ultimate limit and a punishment short only of death. Reformation of the convicts was not seen as an objective of the Norfolk Island penal settlement. The evidence that has passed down through the years points to the creation of a «hell and paradise». A widespread and popular notion of the harshness of penal settlements, including Norfolk Island, has come from the novel For the Term of His Natural Life by Marcus Clarke, which appears to be based on the writings and recollections of witnesses. However, though Clarke did carry out primary research, he selected the most sensational examples possible. Following a convict mutiny in 1834, Father William Ullathorne, Vicar General of Sydney, visited Norfolk Island to comfort the mutineers due for execution. He found it the most heartrending scene that I ever witnessed. Having the duty of informing the prisoners as to who was reprieved and who was to die, he was shocked to record as a literal fact that each man who heard his reprieve wept bitterly, and that each man who heard of his condemnation to death went down on his knees with dry eyes, and thanked God. The 1846 report of Magistrate Robert Pringle Stewart exposed the scarcity and poor quality of food, inadequacy of housing, horrors of torture and incessant flogging, insubordination of convicts, and corruption of overseers. Bishop Robert Wilson visited Norfolk Island from Van Diemen's Land on 3 occasions. Following his first visit in 1846 he reported to the House of Lords who, for the first time, came to realise the enormity of atrocities perpetrated under the British flag and attempted to remedy the evils. Wilson returned in 1849 and found that many of the reforms had been implemented. However, rumours of resumed atrocities brought him back in 1852, and this visit resulted in a damning report, listing atrocities and blaming the system, which invested one man at this remote place with absolute power over so many people. Only a handful of convicts left any written record, and their descriptions of living and working conditions, food and housing, and, in particular, the punishments given for seemingly trivial offences, are unremittingly horrifying, describing a settlement devoid of all human decency, under the iron rule of the tyrannical autocratic commandants. However, these conclusions have been reached by a reliance on a series of overused sources, without their having been tested or drawn into question by detailed archival research. Such work is currently being done and has, for example, drawn into question the sensationalized version of Norfolk Island's past, such as in demonstrating that the widespread assumption that Norfolk Island convicts engaged in murder-suicide pacts, that is, drawing lots to select a killer and willing victim to escape from Norfolk Island, is a myth. The actions of some of the commandants, such as Morisset and particularly Price, appear to be excessively harsh. All but one were military officers, brought up in a system where discipline was severe throughout the period of transportation. In addition, the commandants relied on a large number of military guards, civil overseers, ex-convict constables, and convict informers to provide them with intelligence and carry out their orders. Of the commandants, only Alexander Maconochie appeared to reach the conclusion that brutality would breed defiance, as demonstrated by the mutinies of 1826, 1834 and 1846, and he attempted to apply his theories of penal reform, providing incentives as well as punishment. His methods were criticized as being too lenient and he was replaced, a move that returned the settlement to its harsh rule. However, recent research has also demonstrated that the level of punishment under Maconochie's regime was much higher than assumed, as the average number of lashes per flogging 93 was higher under Maconochie than at any other time during the Second Penal Settlement's history. The Second Penal Settlement began to be wound down by the British government after 1847 and the last convicts were removed to Tasmania in May 1855. It was abandoned because transportation to Van Diemen's Land had ceased in 1853 and was replaced by penal servitude in the United Kingdom. Settlement by Pitcairn Islanders on 8 June 1856. The next settlement began on Norfolk Island. These were the descendants of Tahitians and the HMS Bounty mutineers, resettled from the Pitcairn Islands, which had become too small for their growing population. The British government had permitted the transfer of the Pitcairners to Norfolk, which was thus established as a colony separate from New South Wales but under the administration of that colony's governor. They left Pitcairn Islands on 3 May 1856 and arrived with 194 persons on 8 June. The Pitcairners occupied many of the buildings remaining from the penal settlements, and gradually established their traditional farming and whaling industries on the island. Although some families decided to return to Pitcairn in 1858 and 1863, the island's population continued to slowly grow as the island accepted settlers, often arriving with whaling fleets. In 1867, the headquarters of the Melanesian Mission of the Church of England were established on the island, and in 1882 the Church of St. Barnabas was erected to the memory of the mission's head Bishop John Coleridge Pattison, with windows designed by Edward Burne-Jones and executed by William Morris. In 1920 the mission was relocated from the island to the Solomon Islands to be closer to its target population. 20th century after the creation of the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901, Norfolk Island was placed under the authority of the new Commonwealth government to be administered as an external territory. During World War II, the island became a key airbase and refueling depot between Australia and New Zealand and the Solomon Islands. Since Norfolk Island fell within New Zealand's area of responsibility, it was garrisoned by a New Zealand Army unit known as N-Force at a large army camp which had the capacity to house a 1,500-strong force. N-Force relieved a company of the 2nd Australian Imperial Force. The island proved too remote to come under attack during the war and N-Force left the island in February 1944. In the late 1960s a mini-invasion by British expats followed after the island was featured on a BBC television documentary presented by Alan Wicker. 50 families decided to emigrate from the United Kingdom to Norfolk Island as a result of the programme. In 1979, Norfolk was granted limited self-government by Australia, under which the island elects a government that runs most of the island's affairs. As such, residents of Norfolk Island are not represented in the Commonwealth Parliament of Australia, making them the only group of residents of an Australian state or territory not represented there. In 2006, a formal review process took place, in which the Australian government considered revising this model of government. The review was completed on 20 December 2006, when it was decided that there would be no changes in the governance of Norfolk Island.